It is now clear that we've achieved the most incredible political thing. Look what happened. Is this crazy?
A sweeping victory for President-elect Donald Trump.
Frankly, this was, I believe, the greatest political movement of all time. There's never been anything like this in this country, and maybe beyond.
Trump has already won the swing states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, and Wisconsin. He's leading in Nevada and Arizona. A bigger win overall than 2016.
I think it was a referendum on the current administration.
Earlier today, I spoke with President-elect Trump and congratulated him on his victory.
Democrats now confront a huge task in rebuilding, faced with a new political coalition.
While I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign.
Once secure communities deserted them, including many Latino and black voters.
He's a businessman like me, first and foremost. He's not a politician.
Republicans have also taken control of the Senate. The final hope for Democrats, the House, remains up for grabs. This victory will likely make Trump the most politically empowered US leader of modern times. All the way from pariah to president.
Many people have told me that God spared my life for a reason. And that reason was to save our country and to restore America to greatness.
I spoke to Mark McKinnon in Pennsylvania. Mark McKinnon, welcome to 7:30.
Glad to be aboard, Sarah. How are you?
More to the point, how are you feeling today?
Well, stunned and surprised, as is almost everybody here in America and most of the world. The fact that Trump won was not necessarily shocking. The polling all along had it very close, but he won in such convincing manner across the board. Just a realignment of the coalitions that have typically elected Republicans. He won with Hispanics. He won with black voters. He won with young voters, which I think is a really important point. But at the end of the day, I think the question is what happened? And fundamentally, I think it's one simple thing, which is we know now from the polling and exit polls that 75% of the country were very unhappy with the direction we are headed. And when you are running for election as an incumbent, as the vice president of the administration that's been in charge for the last 4 years, and 75% of the people are unhappy with where the country's headed, that's a big hill to climb. And at the end of the day, Harris just could not overcome that hill.
How much of that was a response to the tough numbers in the cost of living over the past few years in America, or a more profound rejection of the Biden administration?
Well, again, I mean, when it's this big and it's this across the board, you can pick your topic about why it happened. But again, the simplest explanation, I think, is the right one, which is people were unhappy. They wanted a change. They're unhappy with what they got, and a big part of what was happening in America is that there was inflation. People were unhappy with the economy. The border was an issue. But definitely the economy played a role in all the polling. People cite, basically that they did not feel like their economic interests had been top of mind for the Biden administration, and they thought Trump would deliver better on the economy.
Tell me about Pennsylvania, where you are, because we all expected it to be the pivotal state, but Trump was able to put together a very powerful winning coalition, a bigger coalition statewide than any Republican has ever done. How did he do that in the big state, the big key state of Pennsylvania?
Well, he did it here, which is, the pivotal key swing state, but as it turned out, he won all the swing states. And by the way, he won the overall vote, which is the first time a Republican has done that since my old boss, George W. Bush, in 2004. So it's a really across-the-board thing. The thing that caught my attention among the new voters that he attracted was young voters, and Gen Z voters made up 1 in 10 voters in 2020, and they made up 1 in 6 this time. And there was just a presumption that because they're young, they're usually more liberal. Biden won young voters by 23 points. Harris, amazingly, only won them by 11 points. So there was a 12-point gap. She did 12 points worse with young voters, even as a woman of color who you'd think would do very well with young voters. So that's really, that there's something going on with young voters that the radar didn't pick up. Young voters, who you would expect to be Democratic, were largely voting for Trump, young men especially, but even many women.
Let me just ask you about the Latino vote, because the phenomenon of Latinos moving towards the Republicans and certainly being enthusiastic about Trump is not new, but it was bigger than before. Did the Democrats fail to deal with that issue going into the election?
Yeah, a big problem for the Democratic Party is that they've had these coalitions that include Hispanic and black voters that they've largely been taking for granted for years. Because they voted Democratic for so long, they just assumed they would continue to, and ignored them. And I spent a lot of time in Texas with George W. Bush, and there were a lot of people that said, "Oh, there's a growing number of Hispanics in Texas, so that means it's going to turn Democratic." Just, subscribing to that mythology that all Hispanics are liberal. Well, they're not. In fact, they're very conservative. In fact, Trump won all the border counties in Texas that are almost, a huge majority Hispanics. And Trump has a very blue collar. I mean, he picked off part of the new coalition that he's stolen from Democrats is white working people in America. But the thing that's surprising is the number of blacks and especially Hispanics. I think when you net it all out, the number of Hispanics is going to be an eye-popping number that voted for Trump.
So does that add up to a profound realignment in American politics?
There's absolutely a profound realignment in American politics. There's no question about it. I mean, that's the thing about the size of this win. It's like, had it been closer, you could go back and say, well, because Harris didn't do this or didn't do that. I think arguably with these results, it wouldn't have mattered who the Democrats elected. Americans were just tired of Democrats, Democratic policies, and because of the realignment among demographic groups, this is going to be, a huge opportunity for Republicans going forward and a huge challenge for Democrats to try and figure out how they put it back together.
Let me just ask you about Kamala Harris. You just said you think it wouldn't have made any difference who the candidate was. Would it have made any difference if she'd had more time, a proper primary process? Did she just not have enough time to define herself, or did she make the wrong campaign choices?
Yeah, listen, I think that it was a huge challenge to run a presidential campaign in just 100 days. The campaigns that I've worked on, you have years to develop your reflexes and your abilities to campaign and do well. And to interact with voters, to have your policy positions, and so to do that in 100 days was a really, really high bar for Harris. I mean, I think she did pretty well. But again, I'll just say she was a pretty good candidate, especially for coming out of the chute in just 100 days. So I don't think there's anything you could point to. I mean, she made mistakes about not being, arguing more clearly for change or how she would have been different for Biden. I think that was problematic, and I think that was a mistake. But at the end of the day, I don't think that that's what killed her campaign. There were much larger forces at work here, just generally about an appetite for change. The Democrats were in power. People said, we're done with them. Time for a change.
And just about you, you're a Bush Republican. What do you do as a Bush Republican? How do you find your place in what looks like a now fully reformed Republican Party in the shape of Donald Trump?
Well, I'm on an island, and I have been for a while. I was a compassionate conservative in the Bush-McCain mold. And, Donald Trump has just remade this Republican Party into one that I don't recognize. I thought before that there might be some rebuilding of the Republican Party in a new way that maybe was new or reflected the old way of Reagan and Bush and McCain. That's clearly not going to happen now. So for disaffected Republicans like me, there's not much of a future in the Trump Republican Party. There's not going to be another party. It's going to be the Trump Republican Party probably for as long as I live now.
Mark McKinnon, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Glad to do it, Sarah.